This is the Lockpicker 1969, and welcome to my channel, and welcome to another episode of Challenge Lock Workshop. Today's interview is with Challenge Lock maker Diggs. Say hi.
What's up, YouTube?
So, how long have you been making Challenge Locks? Or locks in general?
Let's see. Well, the first one I made was when I was still a blue belt or trying to get blue belt. So that was ooh, about 5 years ago. So I've been making slash picking slash dealing with locks for about 5 years.
Okay. So, when did you make your first Challenge Lock then for Blue Belt? But can you talk about that a bit?
Yeah. So at the time, the American 1100 wasn't used very frequently for challenge lock building. It was mostly people using like your typical deadbolt cores. So there's a lot of kicks and a lot of mortise cylinders. So I thought it would be neat to do an American 1100, and I discovered that the Schlage retention pins for the back. How do I describe that? There's a ring on the back that keeps the plug installed in the body, and
Yeah.
there's
The
a sprung pin back there, right?
yeah.
So that pin is the exact same size as the chambers on an 1100, but it's longer, so it gives you some meat to grab onto. So I made all of my security pins out of those things,
Okay.
and then what else did I do to that? I welded the face of that thing out to the point where there was nothing to tension from anymore. Um, and I don't know. Some people hate that. I thought it was funny. Um, just I was trying to remove the ability for you to tension at top of the keyway entirely, and I almost achieved that. So it was a pretty silly looking well in the face of that lock. And then I spent a fair bit of time with a Dremel, putting my name and some patterns into the actual the outside of that padlock
Uh
body,
huh.
and sent it off to Den Brass up in Canada. And he was kind enough to film it, and that was, I think he picked it in like 5 minutes. He didn't. It wasn't a challenge for him because he figured out that he could stick a tensioner, a top of the keyway tensioner, a real thin one, in between the sidewall of the keyway and pin number one. And that's what I did not think about, was that he was just gonna, do talk anyway, and he
Okay.
did.
So, did that first challenge lock you did for Blue Belt inspire you to want to make more locks?
Absolutely, yeah. That was at the very beginning of my adventure with locks. So um, I didn't have much machinery then. In fact, I had no machinery. I was working with a Dremel and a regular battery powered drill, and I used a combination of those two to make my pins. Um, but modifying that lock and seeing the final result and sort of putting my name on it and taking ownership of it, that was, I think that was pretty instrumental in the idea of that I would in the future make more locks.
Okay. So, how many locks would you say you've made?
Oh, let's say, um, specifically, like if I, by my own definition, challenge locks, I've only made one, but locks total, um, let's see, 146, I think.
Now, were these different locks, or were they tooled similarly?
No, so the vast majority of that number is Alpha and Bravo. So
Okay.
I made a custom full mortise bodied lock with 3 bolts called Alpha, and it's sort of like my attempt at a high security wafer lock. And then Bravo is more of a standard pin tumbler with some security pins in it and a wide open keyway. And it's actually, part of my hope for that lock was that people would turn it into a challenge lock because it's got a lot of real estate, and its outer body is pretty square, so it lends itself well to being held in a vise and manipulated.
Okay. So, between Alpha and Bravo, which one would you say was the most difficult to make?
Oh, Alpha by a mile.
And
Um,
why was that?
they both, yeah, I mean, they took me a similar amount of time. just because of life events. Like I've had a lot of stuff going on this past year with Bravo, but um, so the simplest answer is part count. I mean, Bravo's a pin tumbler, therefore it's mostly pins and springs for the mechanism, and I didn't make any of those. Lab did, so that alone is a bunch of time saved. Alpha, like I literally made every part of that lock except for the screws, so all of the wafers, all of the bodies, and it total piece count on that was like 1,200 something parts. Bravo total piece counts like 400 something parts.
So, how many copies of Alpha did you make?
I made 79 of those.
Wow. Holy cow.
Yeah, it took me a year. And it was it was a brutal year of learning how to not machine.
Okay. So, if I recall from us talking before, you had to learn to use some new machinery. Did I remember that correctly?
Yeah, yeah. Before Alpha, I hadn't. The only thing that I had machined was pinning trays, and that's where I started because I wanted to uh, learn how to use the CNC mill I bought to make locks. I just didn't know how to use it well enough to start with locks.
Okay.
So
So,
yeah, it was
how were
mhm,
your early passes at using it?
brutal. So somebody out there actually has uh, no, two somebodies out there. I want to say Rubber Band and Logan each have a bunch of ruined trays from real early on, and I don't know. I took a picture and threw it in the Discord one day of my box of sins, and they were like, "Well, I want that." Like I was like, it's half finished and it has jagged edges, but they wanted it anyway, so uh,
Okay.
they divvied it up, and I shipped them each a box full of ruined stuff. Um, but yeah, I kept a couple of the very first ones, and it looks like I made a beautiful tray and then destroyed it with a hacksaw. That's how bad they are.
Okay. So, between Alpha and Bravo, those have been out in the hands of pickers.
So Bravo's still in my hands. It's
Okay.
literally being put in boxes and shipped as we speak.
Okay.
But
Because
Al,
the next question I was going to ask is, which one do you feel the community had the most difficulty picking?
oh yeah, well, I mean Alpha's been out there for a little over 9 months and no one's picked it yet. And I have a feeling that almost everybody that bought a Bravo will be able to pick it on their first try because
Okay.
it's not built as a high security lock. It's built more as a test platform, and so I mean it has some security pins. It may give some people some trouble, but really what I was testing was, uh, how difficult is it to make a pin tumbler? Do you actually need warding or not? There's a surprise answer to that question, and um, and really my ultimate test was, does the diameter of pin chambers matter as much as I think it does, right? Because in the picking community we talk about tolerances a lot, but what we actually mean is fit. The machining term is fit. So how well does a pin fit inside of a pin chamber? And what I discovered is that there's more slop in a standard lock than you might imagine. And I wanted to find out how much harder it would be to pick if I could half that. So that's what I did. I took the standard gap between a pin and the wall that it's riding on from 2.5 thousandths to 1.25.
Okay.
So my hope is that even with a wide open keyway, even with no warding, that this thing is still challenging.
Okay.
That being said, the people that I sell locks to are master lock pickers, so I don't imagine it's going to present a huge challenge.
Okay. So we did our your interview for interview with a lockpicker, we
Hmm.
briefly touched on a project that you're working on, and I hope that we could potentially go in a little more detail about that because, frankly, while not really a challenge lock, it's still a community type project. And I was hoping you might want to talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so my timeline for all of my projects is constantly moving backward. So this thing hasn't launched yet, but the core premise of the project is um, that we, as lockpicking, as the lockpicking community, uh, design a lock together and then manufacture a few. And it really is a lot. It has a lot of similarities with setting out to make your first challenge lock because there's a bunch of things you have to consider that you've
Choices.
probably never considered before. You
Yeah,
know,
lots of choices.
yeah, there's tons of them. So it's, aesthetic choices. It's what's my base platform? What's the mechanism going to be? Am I going to aim for this is really difficult to pick and high security, or am I going to aim for this is fun to pick and novel? Um,
Hmm.
and wha- what I see for the most part is uh, the the majority of challenge locks that I have personally seen are pin tumblers, right? They have sometimes been modified by removing material. They've sometimes got just really gorgeous, intricate pins in them. But for the most part, they stay within that platform. I haven't seen a whole lot of them outside of pin tumblers, though they do exist. Um, and so I guess it's this project gives us the opportunity to step into any sort of mechanism platform that we want. It could be wafers, it could be discs, it could be anything, any lock platform that you can think of. Um, and there's always the opportunity for one that's never existed too, and
Hmm.
that's what I'm personally after is, um, we've had 100 something years of pin tumblers, but what if we come up with something that's never been made before?
Yep.
And that's the sort of thought that keeps me at it.
So, what inspired you to come up with this idea?
Well, it has a bunch of advantages as a project, but I think I think the motivating emotion behind this is guilt. Um, just that it took me so long to make the locks that I did make, um, and discovering that pre-orders is not something that I'm good at, and it's not something that I want to continue doing. Sort of got me thinking, okay, well, how do I switch up the way that I make locks? Um, and so, best case scenario with the level of machine that I have is that I do prototyping, right? I make a few
Sure.
locks so that I can really focus on making each one perfect because my machine has limits. And so do I as a machinist. I'm not some professional machinist. I only have a couple years doing this.
Hmm.
Um, so my goal is to sort of transition to I'm going to make lots of different locks. And so it is stepping more towards back towards the challenge lock world because my idea is I want to make more mechanisms. I want to make
Sure.
more additional mechanisms that could be added onto standard platforms. And then, if it's cool enough that it needs to be mass produced, then somebody else can do that.
Hmm.
I'll outsource it and try to keep the cost low enough that people can actually buy them.
Yeah, definitely.
But for the project specifically that we were talking about, that's not a for profit thing. That's more like a I'm sorry it took me so long to make Alpha and Bravo sort of thing, and an educational pursuit. Like
But
I've learned a ton about locks in general and why they are the way they are, trying to make them. So I figure why not take everybody along for that ride? You know.
yeah, so I'm sorry, but let's do something cool together.
Hmm.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So here's a question for you. Because you've made pins, correct?
Yes.
Okay, so would you say that you have a favorite or favorites that you enjoy creating?
I missed the first part of that question, actually. You said
Yeah,
something
sure.
about what I enjoy creating.
Yeah, pins. What kinds of pins?
Oh, I see. I think what I'm always aimed at is what is something that's going to feel different than it actually is?
Mhm.
Um, because if you make a pin well enough, people will be able to immediately identify its type.
Mhm.
Um, and so, um, what I've noticed is that some of these challenge lock makers are so talented that they make these like almost flawless pins of various types, right? But the result is that when I go to pick them, I can actually tell what they are,
Mhm.
and therefore I know how to respond to it. Excuse me. But what I've also seen is that some brand new guys will go to make a pin, and they don't maybe have the best tools to do it with, or spend that much time on it because they're kind of really after getting that blue belt, and
Sure. Yep.
so so the result winds up being a pin that is a little mushroomed, or slightly tapered, or has this like
Unin
asymmetrical feature to it.
Unintentionally, yeah.
Yeah, yeah, and maybe they don't know that it's gonna result in picking so weird that you can't possibly tell what it is,
Mhm.
but that's nevertheless the result. So, yeah, there's this really interesting balance of, in challenge locks specifically, of how hard are you gonna go at making that pin perfect? Because generally speaking, what I think is more important is it lasts, the key can operate it correctly, and it's hard to figure out what it is.
Yep. I
So
mean, I don't know. I've actually find sitting there and spinning, brass rod and just making pins to be very therapeutic. Um,
yeah.
get totally lost in that while it's going on. So,
Yeah, if you've never watched a lathe video on YouTube, you should look it up
yeah.
because that's mesmerizing to watch
Yep.
people work on a lathe.
Well, it's just working on even a single kind of pin. You're not, when you're doing it by hand, no two pins come out exactly the same.
True. Yeah.
So there's subtle differences in any number of things that make each pin different. So, all right. So, as far as modifications go to a lock, what types of modifications do you enjoy utilizing or enjoy seeing in locks that are created for the purpose of challenge locks?
So I like it anytime somebody adds a mechanism, right? And it can be the same as the primary mechanism. So let's say you have a pin tumbler, but somebody adds a check pin, or somebody adds adds a pin that hides in the back behind some wording. Um, that's my favorite sort of thing. Is it's not a trap. It's not something that's going to get you stuck where you can't recover without prior knowledge of its existence, but it adds difficulty because you have to investigate that lock to
Hmm.
figure out that it's even there. Those are my favorite for sure.
Okay. So I was going to ask, what are your go-to tools for making challenge? Well, for making locks, other than the CNC.
Well, yeah, well, believe it or not, even the ones that I make with the CNC mill, um, sometimes need to be hand sanded, uh, because it's off by a thousandth of an inch or a couple thousandths in a dimension where it just can't be. And so, what's a good for instance? So the Alpha Key, for example, had it was exactly right in the dimensions of the key tip, right? The part that actually interacts with the guts of Alpha, but it had a burr on the upper bitting that I had to remove on every single one of those locks by hand.
Mm,
Um,
wow.
and so, I ruined a key trying to do that with a file just to see, can I do this with a quick pass of a file? The answer was no. So I wound up hand sanding every one of those keys. Um, and what was the one that was real bad? The shuttle inserts, where the key lands, and it has the post that the key sits on. Those things, I don't know what happened, if it was like an extreme temperature fluctuation in my run of those, or what, or tool wear. Something happened where about 20% of them were just way too small. The the outer diameter of the inner portion where the key actually needs to slide in and fit. Some of them, just the key would just not go in. So I wound up hand sanding a bunch of those.
Oh boy.
So yeah, so my tools for this, other than the CNC mill, is all by hand. It's hand files and sandpaper, high grit sandpaper.
Okay.
And that's the safe way. If you're trying to get something to fit really precisely and you don't have precision machinery, the answer is high grit sandpaper, because
Okay.
you can control the removal of the
Yeah.
outer layers of that
You
so precisely.
you can take it off, but you can't put it back on.
Correct. So measuring often and going real slowly with
Yeah.
a very high grit is how you get something just airtight.
So, as a lockmaker, what would you say is, for those of us who can't afford a CNC machine, what would you say is one tool that you feel every challenge lockmaker should have in their arsenal?
Oh, Dremel, hands down.
Definitely.
There is nothing more important than a Dremel for this.
Yeah.
A very close second, though, is a vise.
Yep.
And that's more for modifying the body and the plug than it is for pins.
Yep.
But a vise, and there is such a thing as a pin vise also. So that kind of falls in the same camp.
Well, what do you think of using jigs?
Well, jigs in general are awesome if you want to do the same thing multiple times.
Yeah.
So it kind of takes a little bit of the human error out of a process.
Mhm.
So yeah, if you, like, let's say you added a bunch of pins to a lock and you wanted to make 10 of them that were the exact same, then absolutely make a jig.
Okay, I'm going to ask you an interesting, I hope, question that relates back to something you said earlier about people making perfect pins. If you're using a jig and you've got this method down that's making these perfect modifications, do you feel you run into the same issue with, you can identify that more easily as far as what's going on?
I mean, yes. Me versus an individual pin, yes, I would agree with that sentiment. That being said, if you have a jig and you can make a lot of a specific type of element and you put a lot of those elements into a lock, the more elements there are, the harder it is, especially if they have variants. So what you have in any given lock is a binding order. And sometimes that can change, but usually it doesn't. In a challenge lock, however, when you've started altering the shape of the plug and you've started altering the shape of the pins, you can very often have a lock that does not bind in the same order any given time. And so if you, I guess the answer is, a really well-made element is easy to read if there's only a few, but a really well-made element across a larger number of iterations makes it very, very hard, because not only can you not tell where the one is, you can't tell where any of them are.
Okay.
And that's, you sort of have to progress through a lock like that by just poking and prodding around until it can actually give you some sort of feedback.
Okay, so last question before we wrap up. Are there any challenge lock makers out there that you either take inspiration from or admire their work?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I have been around for a hot minute, and the earliest guy that I saw just dump hours of dedication into this was Supa Llama, and uh, he's kind of fading into the gray now, because he left the Discord, left the community, I think about 2.5 years ago now. But the locks he made were incredible. The one that comes to mind was a Medico. I want to say it was a Medico original or Biax, one of the two. But he set it up such that it had 3 sidebars.
Oh, jeez.
And so if you wanted to pick this lock, you not only did you have to pick it, but you had to pick it 3 times. and he did something with the rotation too that made it harder. So as far as I know, he made like 5 or 6 challenge locks that were like really deep dive level projects, and they had body counts. Like they were getting mailed around, and people were just like, "I can't do this," and they would have to mail it off. Um,
As if 1 or 2 sidebars wasn't enough.
right? Yeah, exactly. Like you already got a high security. So I guess what the interesting thing of note with him is that he specifically made challenge locks out of high security base models. So he wasn't trying to elevate a $15 lock to a $50 lock. He was starting with a $50 lock
Yeah.
and gutting 3 of them and taking the sidebars from them and altering that. So that, yeah, it was definitely inspiring. Um, Den Brass is way up there just for the sheer number that he's made, the quality that they have, the fact that he always seems to be able to make a lock that still works but is just crunchy, man. Like the the highs and lows in his are so extreme, that you wouldn't expect it to be able to function, but they always do.
Hmm.
So I've got a lot of respect for him. And I know Gravity Karma made some deadly ones. The names I'm hearing on the scene now are Peace Weapon and Jay Gabriel, who I think you just interviewed, right?
Yeah, Jay Gabriel is a mad scientist.
They're making some crazy stuff.
Oh yeah.
And Harry Bow too. Somebody sent me one of his recently, I think, and it came with a sticker that said, well, what was it? Harry Bow beat me good or something like that.
Yeah.
Something to that effect.
Beat
And I'm
me,
like,
beat me like a drum or something like that.
there it
Yeah.
is. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
And I'm like, I'm a little intimidated by that. So I've got I think 3 or 4 of them in packages right now that have just been waiting, and I've left them in the packaging because I want to do on my YouTube channel a video for each one that gets sent to me, where it's like, me versus this challenge lock maker.
Hmm.
And I'm gonna show off all the pain that it brings. If it takes me 4 hours, it's gonna be a 4 hour long video. Um, but yeah, I miss picking. I haven't really had the time to do it, and now that I'm finally finishing Bravo and getting it out of my garage, um, I want to start the design project with the whole community, but I also want to get back to picking.
Sure.
Been too long.
So, is there any advice you'd like to give or words you'd like to share with our audience that are challenge lock makers or ones that are considering making challenge lock that you want to pass on?
Sure. My advice would be try to ask around of things that have been done. Your first 10 ideas that you have probably not only been had but done, and probably done several times. And that's not a dig against anybody that's new to lockpicking. Maybe you're a super genius, but the reality is lockpicking attracts really smart people
Mm-hmm.
who have great ideas, and and then a lot of those people are also able to execute their ideas. So if you're new to this, ask around specifically about your best ideas, and wait until somebody's like, "Oh, I've never seen that before," and then
Mhm.
do that,
Okay.
because that'll add something to the community.
All right. Well, I want to thank you for doing the interview. Wanted to definitely get your insights and give us a chance to talk a little bit more about Alpha and Bravo as well, and your project. So I appreciate you taking the time to do the interview with me today. So
Hey, no problem. I appreciate the series. I think it's a great idea, and I think it's a service.
I'm trying. I'm trying.
Yeah.
It's a passion of mine. I really enjoy, and doing this series is definitely giving me the excuse to sit down and start making some more challenge locks. So
Yeah, I'm
It's-
inspired to do another one. I just, I need like 5 minutes.
yeah, tell me about it. All right. Well, with that, we'll wrap this one up. I want to thank everybody for listening. And if you are a subscriber, thank you. If you are not yet a subscriber, please hit that subscribe button, turn on notifications and all, and hit like on the video. And thank you for listening.